What if a small act of kindness, something you did every morning without thinking, was never small at all, but a quiet test of faith? Ethan Miller, a 38-year-old U.S. Army veteran struggling with debt, trauma, and a fading sense of purpose, worked the early shift at a rundown diner, accompanied by his retired German Shepherd, Ranger, the dog who once saved his life in war. Every morning at exactly 7:15, a silent, gruff old man named Henry walked in, sat at the same corner table, ordered the same meal, and barely spoke a word. Ethan never rushed him, never judged him, just poured the coffee, cut the toast, and treated him with dignity, expecting nothing in return. What Ethan didn't know was that Henry wasn't just watching him. He was remembering a loss tied to war and guarding a secret powerful enough to change everything. Because one stormy morning, Henry didn't come in. Instead, 4 men in black suits did, lawyers, bodyguards, and they asked for Ethan by name. This is a story about faith, loss, and a miracle born from kindness. Stay with us, and ask yourself, what happens when a broken soldier's name appears in the will of a stranger who was never truly a stranger at all? Please support us by subscribing to the channel to follow this emotional journey. A cold, gray dawn settled over Pittsburgh, the kind that soaked into brick walls and bones alike, carrying the smell of rain, old steel, and mornings that arrived without promise. Ethan Miller woke at 4:12 a.m., the same minute his body had learned to rise long after the war had ended, his left knee stiff and aching before his eyes fully opened, the pain dull but constant, like a reminder etched into bone. He lay still for a moment in his narrow apartment, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the slow, steady breathing beside his bed. Ranger was already awake. The German Shepherd lifted his head the instant Ethan shifted, amber eyes alert, ears angled forward with the disciplined patience of a soldier waiting for orders. Ranger was 8 years old now, his black and tan coat threaded with gray along the muzzle, a faint scar pulling the edge of his right ear where shrapnel had once flown too close. He was large, broad-chested, built for endurance rather than speed, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a dog who had learned that vigilance kept people alive. Ethan reached down and rested his hand against Ranger's neck, fingers pressing into the thick fur, grounding himself in the warmth and solidity of the only constant left in his life. Ethan was 38, tall but worn down by years that had carved sharp lines into his angular face, his jaw perpetually shadowed by a short, uneven beard he rarely had the energy to shave. His dark hair was cut close, streaked faintly with gray at the temples, and his eyes, once quick and restless, had settled into a guarded calm that came from seeing too much and speaking too little. Afghanistan had changed him, but it was the months afterward that truly broke something inside him. The medical discharge, the endless paperwork, the sleepless nights, the way civilian life demanded smiles where silence once sufficed. He dressed quietly, pulling on worn jeans and a faded jacket, clipped Ranger's leash in place, and stepped back into the world that no longer knew what to do with men like him. The diner sat on a corner 2 blocks from the river, a squat building of fogged windows and chipped paint that smelled perpetually of coffee, grease, and mornings that never quite ended. Inside, the lights buzzed to life as Ethan tied on his apron. Tony Russo, the owner, was already behind the grill, a thick-set man in his early 60s with a permanent scowl etched beneath thinning gray hair, his movements sharp, his patience short. Tony wasn't cruel, just tired, the kind of man who believed the world owed him something and collected that debt in complaints. Sarah Klein slid into the booth near the counter with a mug of coffee long before customers arrived. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with auburn hair pulled into a messy ponytail and pale skin that freckled easily in summer. Sarah had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, but beneath the sarcasm lived a quiet kindness she rarely admitted to, shaped by a divorce that had taught her not to expect much from anyone. She nodded once at Ethan, not unkindly, then returned to her coffee. At exactly 7:15, the bell above the door chimed. The old man entered, as he always did, his movements slow but deliberate. A tall, narrow figure wrapped in a faded brown overcoat that hung loosely from shoulders that had once been strong. Henry Caldwell's hair was thin and silver, combed back with care, his face deeply lined, pale blue eyes set beneath heavy brows. He walked with a cane, favoring his left leg, and his hands trembled faintly as he removed his gloves. Without looking at anyone, he crossed the diner and settled into the same corner booth by the window, back straight, posture disciplined in a way that spoke of old habits never truly lost. He ordered the same breakfast every morning, voice low and clipped, exact change placed neatly on the table. He did not smile. He did not linger. Ethan served him quietly, as he always did, placing a cup of black coffee within easy reach, cutting the toast into smaller pieces without comment, setting a glass of warm water beside the plate. He never asked Henry questions, never rushed him, never filled the silence with small talk meant to ease his own discomfort. It was a courtesy Ethan understood instinctively, born from years of standing watch beside men who spoke only when words mattered. Henry never thanked him aloud, but sometimes he nodded once, barely perceptible, and Ethan accepted that as enough. Ranger lay beneath the booth, his body aligned perfectly with the edge of the seat, eyes tracking the room with calm precision. Customers came and went, laughter rose and fell, plates clattered, but Ranger did not move. Henry noticed. He noticed the way the dog responded to subtle shifts in Ethan's posture, the way his ears flicked toward the door before the bell rang, the way his gaze never left Ethan's side for long. Henry's eyes lingered on Ranger longer than they ever rested on the man who served him, and something unreadable passed through his expression, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, a shadow crossing his gaze like a memory stirring from deep water. Ethan felt it before he understood it, that faint pressure of being observed. When he glanced toward the corner booth, he expected to meet Henry's eyes, and instead found them fixed on Ranger, studying him with an intensity that made Ethan's chest tighten for reasons he couldn't name. For a moment, the noise of the diner faded, replaced by the echo of distant desert winds and the weight of things left unsaid. Ethan looked away first, unsettled by the certainty that whatever Henry was seeing, it wasn't him. That morning ended like all the others, but as Ethan clipped Ranger's leash and stepped back into the gray Pittsburgh air, a quiet realization settled into his bones, heavier than fatigue. The old man in the corner had never been watching the waiter at all. He had been looking at the dog with the eyes of someone who had once loved deeply and lost something he would never get back. Ethan's days began to fold in on themselves, each one thinner than the last, like pages worn soft by too many hands, the numbers never adding up no matter how carefully he counted them. The rent notice came first, slipped under his apartment door in a pale envelope that felt heavier than paper had any right to be, followed by a call from the vet explaining that Ranger's old injury, an embedded fragment too close to the joint, was flaring again and would need medication that Ethan could barely afford. Ranger sensed the strain even when Ethan said nothing. The dog moved more slowly now, his gait still disciplined but cautious, amber eyes watching Ethan with the quiet concern of a partner who had learned to read danger in silence. At the diner, Tony cut hours without ceremony, muttering about slow mornings and razor-thin margins, while Sarah's jokes sharpened into something brittle, her tall, narrow frame leaning harder against the counter as if the building itself were the only thing keeping her upright. Ethan didn't complain. Complaining had never fixed anything. He simply showed up earlier, left later, and carried his worry the way he'd carried a rucksack once, tight against his back, unseen, unshared. Henry Caldwell kept coming, always at 7:15, always to the same booth. But something in him shifted, subtle as a change in weather pressure. He still wore the faded brown coat and the careful expression of a man accustomed to being overlooked, but now his eyes lingered longer, his attention drifting from Ranger to Ethan and back again, as if tracing a line between them. One morning, as Ethan poured the coffee, Henry spoke without looking up, his voice dry and even. "Which unit were you with?" The question was casual in tone, but precise in shape, the kind that came from someone who understood exactly what he was asking. Ethan paused just long enough to feel the old reflex tighten his shoulders. "3rd Infantry," he answered, keeping his voice neutral. Henry nodded once, filed the answer away, and returned to his breakfast. A few days later, Henry asked about Ranger. Not the usual polite curiosity of customers who wanted to pet him, but specifics. How old was he? Whether he responded better to hand signals than verbal commands. Ethan answered carefully, offering only what was necessary. He told himself it didn't matter, that an old man asking questions wasn't a threat. But something about Henry's calm persistence unsettled him. These weren't the questions of loneliness. They were the questions of recognition. Still, Ethan let it go. The world was full of ghosts. Not all of them meant harm. The diner itself felt heavier with each passing week. Morning regulars complained more, tipped less, and lingered longer, as if their dissatisfaction were a form of entertainment. Sarah snapped at a customer one morning, her pale skin flushing, auburn hair slipping loose from its tie, and immediately apologized with a tired half-smile that betrayed how thin her patience had grown. Later, during a quiet moment by the counter, she leaned toward Ethan and murmured, "You ever feel like this place is swallowing us whole?" Ethan shrugged, eyes on the coffee pot. "Every day." She nodded, accepting the truth of it without drama. Sarah had once worked in a law office, back when her life followed predictable lines, before a failed marriage and a string of quiet disappointments taught her the cost of expectation. Now she survived on sarcasm and cigarettes, a shield she wore well enough to keep people from looking too closely. Outside of work, Ethan's world narrowed further. He stopped answering calls from collection agencies, learned to stretch canned food and rice into meals that felt almost deliberate, and walked Ranger longer at night when the city quieted enough for his thoughts to settle. On one of those nights, rain slicked the streets into mirrors, and Ethan emerged from the diner after closing to find Henry standing across the road beneath a streetlight, his face half-shadowed, posture straight despite the cane. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then a black sedan pulled up beside Henry, its engine barely audible, and a driver stepped out, tall, clean-cut, dressed in a dark suit that didn't belong to the neighborhood. He opened the door with practiced efficiency, and Henry climbed inside without a glance back. The car slid away, tires whispering over wet asphalt, leaving Ethan standing in the rain with Ranger pressed close to his leg. The image refused to settle into anything sensible. The car was too new, too polished. The driver too professional. Ethan stood there longer than necessary, replaying the mornings, the exact change on the table, the worn coat, the careful invisibility Henry seemed to cultivate. It didn't add up. He told himself it didn't matter. People were complicated. Appearances lied. But as he walked home, the weight in his chest shifted, no longer just worry, but curiosity edged with something colder. The next morning, Henry returned as if nothing had changed, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same breakfast. But when Ranger lay down beneath the table, Henry's gaze followed him with an intensity that made Ethan's skin prickle. Ethan caught Sarah watching too, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly, as if she sensed the tension, but couldn't quite name it. The diner hummed around them, unaware, indifferent. Ethan placed the coffee down carefully, his hand steady, despite the questions crowding his mind. Henry met his eyes then, briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement, perhaps, or warning. Ethan realized, standing there with the smell of coffee thick in the air and Ranger's steady presence at his feet, that Henry Caldwell was not simply another lonely old man passing through the mornings. Whatever story he carried, it ran deeper than the corner booth and the black coffee. And for the first time since Ethan had come home from the war, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest that meant trouble was close, even if he couldn't yet see its shape. The morning began with the kind of quiet that made Ethan uneasy, a thin, brittle silence that clung to the streets of Pittsburgh like frost, the sky low and colorless, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The notice from the landlord arrived before dawn, slipped under the apartment door sometime during the night, its white edge catching the light when Ethan bent to clip Ranger's leash. He read it twice, then a third time, each word settling heavier than the last. 30 days. No extensions. No negotiations. Ethan folded the paper carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket, not because he intended to forget it, but because he needed to function, and panic had never kept a man standing. Ranger sensed the shift immediately. The German shepherd moved with visible stiffness now, his right hind leg favoring the floor just enough to be noticed, his breath shallow after even a short walk. At the vet's office the day before, Dr. Alan Brooks, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the permanently tired eyes of someone who had chosen compassion as a profession, had spoken gently but firmly. The fragment near the joint was inflamed again. Medication would help, maybe injections later. None of it would be cheap. Ethan nodded and signed the papers without hesitation. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was a promise Ethan had made and never intended to break. By the time Ethan reached the diner, his knee throbbed, and the numbers ran circles in his head. Rent against wages, food against medicine, survival against pride. Inside, the diner felt dimmer than usual, the fluorescent lights flickering as if undecided. Sarah stood behind the counter, tall and straight-backed, despite the hour, her auburn hair pulled tight, pale skin marked with faint lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against disappointment. She glanced at Ethan and caught something in his face she didn't comment on, only poured him a cup of coffee without asking. Tony barked orders from the grill, his voice sharp, his temper worse than usual. The pressure of failing margins grinding him down into someone no one wanted to cross before noon. At 7:15, the bell didn't ring. Ethan looked up without meaning to. The corner booth remained empty, its vinyl seat untouched, the table clean and waiting. He told himself it was nothing. People missed mornings. Trains ran late. Bodies failed. At 7:30, the booth was still empty. Ethan found himself glancing toward the door more often than he liked, his chest tightening with a sensation he recognized all too well from patrols gone wrong. Ranger lay beneath the counter, but unlike his usual calm watchfulness, his ears were pricked forward, his body tense, eyes locked on the entrance, as if waiting for a command that never came. By mid-morning, the absence had weight. Sarah noticed it too, her gaze flicking toward the corner, then back to Ethan. "Your friend's late," she said quietly, not unkindly. Ethan shook his head. "He's not my friend." The words sounded hollow even to him. He brewed coffee out of habit and nearly set it down at the empty booth before catching himself. Tony snapped at him for the mistake, and Ethan absorbed it without reaction. His thoughts were elsewhere, circling the image of Henry beneath the streetlight, the black sedan, the driver's crisp movements. Something was wrong. He felt it in his gut, the same place fear had once lived, before he learned how to cage it. Near noon, the bell rang, but the sound was wrong, sharper, heavier, cutting through conversation like a blade. 3 men entered together, their presence altering the room's gravity. They were dressed in tailored dark suits, the kind that didn't wrinkle, their posture confident without arrogance, faces set in expressions trained to remain neutral. Behind them stood a 4th man, broader, heavier through the shoulders, his stance unmistakably protective. He wore a discreet earpiece and scanned the room with professional efficiency, eyes missing nothing. The first man stepped forward. He was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with neatly trimmed dark hair and a clean-shaven face, his movements economical, his voice measured when he spoke. "Ethan Miller?" Heads turned. Conversation died. Sarah froze mid-step. Tony's spatula hovered over the grill. Ethan straightened slowly, Ranger rising to his feet beside him, hackles lifting just enough to signal readiness. "That's me," Ethan said. The man nodded once. "My name is Philip Anderson. These are my colleagues. We represent the estate of Henry Caldwell." The name landed like a blow. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. Images collided in his mind. The empty booth, the precise change, the way Henry's eyes had lingered on Ranger. "Is he?" Ethan stopped, breath catching. Anderson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Caldwell passed away late last night," he said, peacefully. The word felt obscene in Ethan's chest, out of place against the sudden ache rising there. He had known the man only in fragments, only in mornings, and yet the loss felt sharp, immediate, undeniable. Anderson continued, his voice steady. "There are matters related to Mr. Caldwell's will that require your immediate attention." A murmur rippled through the diner. Tony swore under his breath. Sarah stared at Ethan, disbelief flickering across her sharp features. Ethan felt the floor tilt, the sense of control he had clung to all morning slipping through his fingers. "I think there's a mistake," he said quietly. "I just served him breakfast." Anderson shook his head. "There is no mistake." He paused, then added, "Mr. Caldwell was very specific." Ranger pressed against Ethan's leg, solid, grounding. Ethan looked down at him, then back at the men who had brought the past crashing into his present. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something he could outrun. He nodded once. "Give me a minute." Tony didn't argue when Ethan untied his apron. Sarah reached out and squeezed his arm, her grip firm, wordless, her eyes telling him she understood fear when she saw it. As Ethan followed the men toward the door, the corner booth caught his eye one last time, empty and waiting, and a cold certainty settled over him. Henry Caldwell hadn't missed breakfast. He had left it behind, and in doing so had closed the last door Ethan thought he still had open. The ride to the law office felt unreal. The city sliding past the tinted windows in muted colors, as if Ethan were watching his own life through thick glass. The sedan moved smoothly, silently, and the contrast between its polished interior and the worn diner he had just left made his stomach tighten. Ranger lay at Ethan's feet, calm but alert, his broad body filling the narrow space, amber eyes flicking from Ethan's face to the men seated opposite them. Philip Anderson sat straight-backed, hands folded neatly on his briefcase, his expression composed in a way that suggested long familiarity with shock and grief that were not his own. He spoke little, offering only necessary directions, giving Ethan the courtesy of silence. The building they entered stood downtown, all steel and glass, rising cleanly into the gray Pittsburgh sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and paper, the kind of controlled environment where emotions were expected to be checked at the door. They were led into a conference room with a long mahogany table and tall windows overlooking the river. Ethan felt out of place immediately, his worn jacket and tired eyes clashing with the room's quiet authority. Ranger settled beside his chair, posture perfect, ignoring the curious glances from passing staff. Philip Anderson cleared his throat and spoke gently but firmly. "Mr. Miller, I'm very sorry for your loss." Ethan almost corrected him, almost said that Henry Caldwell was not his to lose, but the words stuck. Loss did not always require intimacy. Sometimes it arrived simply because a presence had vanished. Anderson continued, explaining that Henry Caldwell had passed away in his sleep the previous night, alone in his apartment, the cause natural, the end peaceful. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly, an image flashing through his mind of the corner booth, the untouched coffee, the silence where a man used to be. Anderson opened a leather folder and began to speak of Henry in terms Ethan had never imagined. Henry Caldwell had been a defense contractor for decades, a man who had built companies that supplied equipment, logistics, and technology to the military. He had been wealthy beyond measure, his name attached to buildings, funds, and contracts Ethan had never heard of because Henry had never wanted him to. After the death of his only son years earlier, Henry had withdrawn from public life, severed ties with most of his associates, and lived quietly, deliberately small, as if reducing his presence could dull his grief. Ethan listened, stunned, fragments of memory rearranging themselves into something heavier and more complex. The door opened and the air in the room changed. Two people entered together, their presence sharp and immediate. The man was in his early 30s, tall and sharply built, with slicked-back dark hair and a clean, angular face that seemed permanently set in irritation. He wore an expensive suit with the careless confidence of someone who had never worried about earning it. His eyes swept over Ethan with open disdain. Beside him walked a woman in her late 50s, elegant and severe, her silver blonde hair styled flawlessly, her posture rigid, lips pressed thin. She wore black, though whether from mourning or habit was impossible to tell. This was Margaret Caldwell, Henry's sister-in-law, and Lucas Caldwell, her son. Family, by blood if not by warmth. Margaret's gaze lingered on Ethan for half a second too long, her eyes cold, assessing, as if measuring something unpleasant. Lucas didn't bother hiding his contempt. He leaned back in his chair without waiting to be invited, crossing his arms. "This is him?" he said, voice sharp, disbelief edged with offense. "The waiter?" Anderson raised a hand slightly, a gesture of quiet authority. "Mr. Caldwell, please." Lucas scoffed but fell silent, though the hostility in his expression remained. Anderson resumed, his voice steady. "Mr. Caldwell left specific instructions regarding Mr. Miller." He slid a document across the table toward Ethan. "This is a preliminary disbursement." Ethan stared at the number printed there, his breath catching. It was more money than he had seen in his entire adult life, enough to clear every debt, to pay the rent, to cover Ranger's treatment, to breathe again. Anderson read the accompanying clause aloud, Henry's words precise, even in death. "Because he treated me as a man, not an inconvenience. Because dignity should be returned when it is given." Lucas surged to his feet, face flushing. "This is insane. He manipulated my uncle. He preyed on him." Margaret placed a hand on her son's arm, her touch firm, her expression controlled, but burning beneath the surface. "Henry was vulnerable," she said coolly. "Lonely, and this man took advantage." The accusation hit Ethan harder than he expected, not because he believed it, but because it revealed how little they had ever understood Henry at all. Ethan met her gaze, his own steady, voice low. "I never asked him for anything." Silence stretched. Anderson let it linger before speaking again. Mr. Caldwell anticipated these objections. He closed the folder carefully and looked directly at Margaret and Lucas, which is why he ensured that medical evaluations, witness statements, and recordings were completed in advance. Mr. Caldwell was of sound mind. Lucas's jaw tightened. Margaret's eyes flickered, calculating. Ethan sat back, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Grief mixing with disbelief. Fear tangling with something dangerously close to hope. He glanced down at Ranger, who remained still, unbothered by the tension, a reminder of steadiness in a room full of shifting loyalties. He had walked into this building as a man with nothing left to lose. Now he was being handed something he hadn't asked for, and didn't yet understand. Philip Anderson gathered the papers and spoke the words that froze the room. "What you have heard today is only part of Mr. Caldwell's will." He paused deliberately. "There are additional provisions that have not yet been disclosed." Lucas laughed bitterly. Margaret's composure cracked just enough to reveal fear beneath it. Ethan felt a chill trace his spine. Whatever Henry had planned, it was far from finished, and the life Ethan had known was already slipping beyond his reach. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came the way memory often did for men like Ethan, slow, fragmented, and impossible to stop once it began. After the meeting ended, Philip Anderson asked Ethan to stay behind. The Caldwell family left first, Margaret moving with rigid dignity, Lucas throwing one last look of open resentment over his shoulder, as if Ethan were a stain that refused to come out. The door closed softly behind them, sealing the room into a quieter, heavier space. Anderson loosened his tie slightly, a small human gesture that suggested what came next was no longer procedural. "There are things Mr. Caldwell instructed me to share privately," Anderson said. He was a man shaped by restraint. Mid-40s, clean-lined face, dark hair combed neatly back, eyes sharp but not unkind. He spoke with precision, but there was something careful in the way he looked at Ethan now, as if measuring how much weight a man could bear before it broke him. Anderson opened a separate folder, older than the others, its edges worn from frequent handling. Henry Caldwell had a son. His name was Daniel. The name landed in Ethan's chest with unexpected force. Daniel Caldwell had been a canine officer, attached to an infantry unit deployed to the Middle East more than a decade ago. He had been young, disciplined, and by all accounts, fiercely protective of the men under his care. He was described in the reports as tall and athletic, with a narrow, angular face and dark hair that never quite stayed regulation short, a small act of rebellion that earned him quiet smiles from his squad. He had his father's eyes, sharp and pale, and the same reserved temperament, men who did not waste words, but meant every one they spoke. Daniel had been killed during an extraction mission that went wrong, an IED. No warning, no second chances. Ethan listened without interruption, his jaw tightening as the familiar shapes of war took form in his mind. He had seen men like Daniel. He had stood beside them. Anderson continued. Daniel was partnered with a German shepherd named Ranger. The room seemed to tilt. Ethan's breath caught, his gaze dropping instinctively to the dog lying at his feet. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of his name, ears forward, eyes alert. Anderson nodded once, as if confirming something for himself. After Daniel's death, Ranger was transferred between units, then retired early due to injury. Henry spent years trying to locate him. It made sense now, in a way that hurt. The way Henry's eyes had tracked Ranger's movements, the subtle tests, the hand gestures, the pauses, the moments of silence. Henry had not known at first. He had suspected. He had watched Ranger respond to commands no civilian dog should know, watched the discipline beneath the calm, the way Ranger placed himself between Ethan and perceived threats without hesitation. Recognition had come slowly, like grief resurfacing through fog. "And Ethan?" Anderson said quietly. "Henry noticed you too. Not because you were kind, but because you were careful." Henry had not come to the diner to test generosity. He had come because he was searching for something he thought he had lost forever, proof that a soldier could survive loss without becoming hollow. Henry watched the way Ethan moved, how he stood with his back to walls, how his eyes scanned exits, how he spoke little and meant more. He watched how Ethan treated Ranger not as a tool or a memory, but as a partner. Henry did not see pity. He saw dignity. Anderson slid another document across the table. It showed the diner's address. Henry purchased the property 6 months ago through a holding company. Ethan stared at the paper, stunned. The diner, the place that barely paid him enough to survive, had been owned by Henry all along. It had been Daniel's idea once. According to letters Henry had saved, Daniel dreamed of opening a small place after his service ended, somewhere quiet, where soldiers and civilians could sit at the same counter and feel equal. Daniel never got that chance. Henry bought the diner not as an investment, but as a memorial. Ethan felt the weight of it pressed down on him, grief braided tightly with something dangerously close to purpose. He thought of the mornings Henry had sat alone, black coffee untouched for long minutes, watching the room as if measuring it against a memory only he could see. "He wasn't watching me," Ethan said quietly. Anderson shook his head. "No, he was watching who you chose to be." Ranger shifted closer, his shoulder brushing Ethan's knee, solid and warm. The connection was undeniable now, painful in its clarity. Ranger had not been chosen by accident. Neither had Ethan. Anderson folded his hands together. "Which brings us to the part of the will that has not yet been disclosed publicly." He paused, letting the words settle. "Henry did not leave you the diner outright." Ethan exhaled, a strange mix of relief and disappointment passing through him. "He appointed you as its managing trustee." The responsibility hit harder than the money ever could. Ethan would oversee the diner and a connected trust fund established in Daniel's name, ensuring the place survived, that its purpose remained intact. He would be accountable, not just financially, but morally. Henry believed ownership was less important than stewardship, Anderson said. He wanted someone who would protect what mattered, not exploit it. Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. He had come to the meeting expecting judgment, maybe punishment. Instead, he had been handed a legacy he had never asked for and was not sure he deserved. "Why me?" he asked finally. Anderson's answer was simple. "Because Henry believed you already understood the cost." As they left the building, the city felt different. No brighter, no kinder, but heavier with meaning. Ethan walked slowly, Ranger at his side, the truth settling into him piece by piece. Henry had not been testing him. He had been grieving, searching, and in the quiet of a corner booth, he had found something worth trusting. Ethan stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, the river glinting dully below. He realized then that the money had never been the point. The diner was not a gift. It was a responsibility, and with it came a choice he could no longer avoid. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a sterile order meant to quiet chaos, but nothing could still the tension coiled inside Ethan Miller's chest. Morning light filtered through tall windows, pale and indifferent, casting long bars across the polished floor. Ethan sat at the defendant's table in a borrowed navy suit that fit his shoulders a little too tightly, his posture rigid from habit rather than confidence. Ranger lay at his feet, older now, his black and tan coat flecked with gray along the muzzle, eyes calm but alert. Service dogs were permitted here by court order, and Ranger seemed to understand the gravity of the space, resting his chin on his paws without a sound. Across the aisle sat the Caldwell family. Margaret Caldwell, Henry's daughter-in-law, held herself like a sculpture carved from ice, tall, slender, silver-blonde hair pinned into a flawless knot, pale skin stretched tight with restrained fury. Her eyes never left Ethan, not with curiosity, but with the cold precision of someone calculating loss. Beside her was Lucas Caldwell, Henry's grandson, early 30s, clean-shaven with sharp cheekbones and an expensive suit that couldn't hide the restless aggression in his movements. He tapped his pen incessantly, jaw clenched, as if the room itself had offended him. At the front of the courtroom stood Judge Eleanor Whitmore, a woman in her early 60s with iron-gray hair cut neatly at the jawline and eyes that missed nothing. Years on the bench had given her a reputation for impatience with theatrics and deep respect for clarity. When she entered, conversation dissolved into silence. "Let's proceed," she said, voice steady, neither warm nor cruel. The Caldwell family's attorney rose first. Victor Hale was a man shaped by confrontation. Mid-50s, broad-shouldered, dark beard trimmed with obsessive care, voice sharpened by decades of accusation. He spoke of undue influence, of a vulnerable elderly man manipulated by a struggling veteran. He painted Ethan as a tragic figure turned opportunist, a man whose kindness was merely camouflage for ambition. As Hale spoke, Lucas nodded sharply, while Margaret stared straight ahead, lips pressed into a thin line. Then Philip Anderson stood. Compared to Hale, he looked almost understated. But when he spoke, the room leaned in. Anderson did not raise his voice. He laid facts on the table one by one, methodical and unadorned. First came the medical records, Henry Caldwell's evaluations from the year before his death, signed by two independent physicians. They confirmed what Henry had insisted on. He was lucid, mentally sound, fully capable of making legal decisions. Judge Whitmore read them carefully, her expression unreadable. Next came the recording. Anderson pressed a button, and Henry's voice filled the courtroom, older, slower, but unmistakably clear. He spoke of loss, of his son, of the quiet mornings of the diner, where no one asked him to be anything other than human. He spoke Ethan's name with respect, explaining why he trusted him, why he believed stewardship mattered more than blood. The room shifted as the recording ended, a subtle unease rippling through even the most hardened faces. Finally, Anderson produced Henry's handwritten letters. The ink was uneven, the script careful, each word deliberate. In them, Henry wrote about Ranger, about recognition dawning piece by piece, about seeing his son's discipline and compassion mirrored in another soldier who had survived. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses to read, lingering on one passage longer than the others. When it was time for Ethan to speak, Anderson gestured gently, offering guidance, but Ethan shook his head. He stood alone, hands clasped loosely in front of him, shoulders squared not in defiance but in acceptance. He did not argue law. He did not defend himself against accusation. He told the truth as he knew it. He spoke of mornings at 7:15, of black coffee cooling untouched, of silence that wasn't empty but heavy with memory. He spoke of Ranger's injuries, of commands remembered long after war ended, of the way Henry's eyes softened when Ranger obeyed a signal no civilian should know. He spoke of being seen, not as a veteran, not as a burden, but as a man capable of care. As Ethan spoke, Ranger lifted his head and pressed closer, a quiet anchor. Ethan finished without flourish. "Henry didn't give me anything because he pitied me," he said. "He trusted me, and I won't dishonor that." Silence followed, thick and absolute. Judge Whitmore leaned back, fingers steepled beneath her chin. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of finality. She dismissed the Caldwell family's claims in their entirety. The evidence was clear, she said. Henry Caldwell acted of sound mind, with intention and clarity. The trust and stewardship granted to Ethan Miller were lawful, deliberate, and beyond interference. Lucas surged to his feet, face flushed with rage, but a single look from Judge Whitmore silenced him. The gavel fell. It was over. Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Ranger stood, tail giving a single slow wag, as if acknowledging an unspoken command. Across the aisle, Margaret turned away without a word. Lucas stared at Ethan with something broken flickering behind his anger. Defeat stripped bare. As the courtroom emptied, Anderson placed a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder. "It's finished," he said. Ethan nodded, though he knew the truth was more complicated. Justice had been served, but responsibility remained. He stepped outside into the cold afternoon, the city humming on, indifferent, yet alive. Ranger walked beside him, steady as ever. Ethan realized then that winning the case was not the end of the fight. It was the beginning of living up to the trust of a man who had seen him clearly and chosen him anyway. Morning returned to Pittsburgh without ceremony, a pale sun lifting itself over brick and steel, as if the city had never noticed the trial at all. Ethan Miller unlocked the diner just before dawn, the key warm from his palm, the bell above the door chiming with the same tired note it always had. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and clean wood. The renovation had been careful. New wiring, repaired floors, a quieter hum to the refrigeration. but the room had not been polished into something unrecognizable. The mustard booths remained, the counter kept its scars, and in the corner by the window, the small table stayed exactly where it had always been. Above it, Ethan had mounted a simple brass plaque, unadorned, engraved with a single line, "Henry's Corner. Everyone is seen." Ranger padded in behind him, 12 years old now, black and tan coat silvering at the muzzle, posture still proud, despite the stiffness in his hips. He took his place near the corner table, a sentinel at rest. The staff arrived in familiar rhythms. Tony, the cook, thick-shouldered with a permanent crease between his brows, still wore his grease-stained cap, but he moved with a new ease, no longer worried about the next cut to hours. Denise, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued, had softened without losing her edge. She ran the floor with the confidence of someone trusted to make decisions. Ethan had kept every promise. Wages were fair, schedules humane, repairs done without speeches. Leadership, he had learned, was less about being seen than about being steady. Ownership changed things in quiet ways. Paperwork arrived daily, the trust's administrators asking for signatures and forecasts. Ethan signed what he understood and asked questions when he didn't. He learned to listen before deciding, the way Henry had listened. The diner began to draw a different crowd, not tourists, not influencers, but people who needed a place to sit without being measured. Veterans drifted in, some alone, some together, eyes scanning exits before relaxing. Ethan never announced the trust, never posted a sign. Help moved the way coffee did, warm, offered. No receipt demanded. Medical bills covered quietly. A month's rent paid without a name attached. Ranger, lying near the counter, became a symbol without trying. Customers left him patches, unit coins, folded notes. Someone painted a small mural behind the register, a shepherd in profile, watchful, patient. Late one afternoon, Sarah Coleman stepped inside, pausing as if unsure she belonged. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender, auburn hair pulled into a loose knot that refused to stay neat. Freckles scattered across pale skin weathered by long hours outdoors. She moved with the guarded grace of someone used to carrying responsibility alone. Sarah ran the neighborhood clinic 2 blocks away, a nurse practitioner who had learned to read pain without asking too many questions. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and a careful smile. "I heard you might help a few of our guys," she said, nodding toward Ranger. Ethan listened, asked what she needed, and wrote down a number. Nothing more was said. The next week, a veteran who had been rationing insulin walked out of her clinic, steady and stunned. On a cold Saturday, the door chimed again at 7:15. Ethan looked up without thinking. A younger man stood there, late 20s, lean, shoulders set as if bracing for a blow. He wore a faded jacket with a unit patch half removed, dark stubble shadowing a narrow jaw, eyes too old for his face. At his side sat a Belgian Malinois, compact and muscular, cinnamon coat tight as wire, amber eyes sharp with training. The dog's ears flicked, then settled. The man hesitated, then chose the corner table. Ranger rose slowly and approached, the 2 dogs exchanging a brief, respectful acknowledgement. No posturing, no challenge. Ethan brought coffee without being asked. "House blend," he said gently. The man nodded, voice rough when it came. "Thanks." He introduced himself as Marcus Reed, former Army, recently home, still figuring out how to sleep. The Malinois, Nova, 2 years old, leaned against his leg, grounding him. Ethan didn't ask about missions. He asked how Marcus took his eggs. When Marcus finally spoke, it was about small things. The noise of the city, the quiet that followed, the way people looked through him. Ethan listened, cutting toast into squares out of habit, setting the plate down with care. As the morning wore on, the diner filled and emptied. Marcus stayed, then stood uncertain. "I didn't think places like this existed," he said, embarrassed by the admission. Ethan smiled, not unkindly. "They don't," he said. "You make them." Marcus nodded once, something easing in his shoulders. He left a folded bill and a unit coin by the saucer. Ranger watched him go, tail giving a single, slow wag. After closing, Ethan sat at Henry's corner and let the quiet settle. The city breathed outside. He thought of the trust's balance, of requests waiting on his desk, of the weight that came with saying yes. He thought of Henry, of Daniel, of the way grief could hollow a man, or give him a reason to build. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's knee, warm and solid. Ethan scratched behind his ears, feeling the years they had carried together. The flame Henry had lit was not loud. It did not burn high or fast. It asked to be tended, daily, patiently, by people willing to see one another. Ethan rose, wiped the table, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow, the bell would ring again. Someone would need coffee. Someone would need to be seen. And Ethan, keeper of a quiet fire, would be there to meet them. Miracles don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come quietly, as a warm cup of coffee, a patient heart, a moment of kindness no one applauds. God often works through people, through those who choose compassion when the world chooses indifference, through small acts that seem ordinary, yet change lives forever. If this story touched you, ask yourself, who around you is waiting to be seen today? And can you be that person, even when no one is watching? May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and heal every silent struggle you carry. May your kindness become someone else's miracle. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Like the video so it reaches more hearts. Subscribe for more stories of faith, redemption, and quiet miracles. Because sometimes the miracle isn't what God gives us, it's who He calls us to be.